You always need to be thinking about ways to eliminate this in your business, and that is waste. Now, do you know what the 7 steps of waste are in business? They're known as Tim Wood. So, transportation, inventory, motion, waiting, overproduction, overprocessing, and defects. I was always big into operational efficiency, and I actually had this acronym hanging above my desk when I used to work in a warehouse. As a business owner, you need to strive for operational excellence if you really want to grow and achieve your full potential. You should always be thinking of ways to eliminate waste and streamline production. And I guarantee you, every business has waste that you can cut in one way or another. So let's really dig into this for a second. The first one is transportation. This was a big issue when I worked in a warehouse, and it's been a small issue with my business, but it's definitely an issue that I have been working on. Now, how can you identify and combat transportation waste in your business? So, when I was working in a warehouse, for example, we had multiple warehouses within a 2 or 3 block radius, and that was a big transportation waste. It's constantly going between different warehouses to find inventory. Either I was personally doing it as a warehouse supervisor, or I was sending teams over to go find it and go get it and bring it back to the main warehouse, spending a lot of time loading up trucks, loading up box trucks, moving around pallets. All that stuff is transportation waste. And I wasted hours doing all of this. This created a bottleneck because we didn't have one big warehouse. We were growing as a company way too quickly, and we just started buying up warehouses near us. So it was definitely a lot of transportation waste where I used to work. Now in my business, I try to minimize transportation waste, but sometimes I still see it happening. Moving inventory between warehouses because you run out of inventory in one spot, things like that, things that I want to get better at, and I have been getting better at it. But like I said, when I worked in a warehouse, I saw a lot of it. So always try to keep that in mind. You don't want transportation waste. So think of ways to minimize transportation waste. Operational excellence is what you want to strive for. Have the appropriate amount of inventory in each location is a good example of that. Okay, number two, we have inventory. You don't want to have too much inventory sitting around, obviously. Yes, this step of waste happens and it's going to happen, but this is why you need to carefully analyze your sales and you need to know how much you're going to expect in sales. Because you never want too much inventory sitting around, especially if you're paying storage fees. So identify products that sell, keep an eye on products that aren't, and try not to have too much inventory sitting in one place. The next step of waste that creates bottlenecks is motion. This was something else that I really had problems with at my last job. As a warehouse supervisor, I noticed that there is a lot of waste with motion in the lean manufacturing process. I took a lot of steps to solve this and mitigate it successfully with a few tricks. One of the biggest things that I noticed was that there wasn't all of the products that I deemed necessary at each workstation. I noticed that warehouse employees didn't always have everything they needed to pack an order, and they'd have to venture off into different aisles to different sections of the warehouse, or if they really couldn't find it, they'd have to go find a supervisor to go retrieve the item for them. This obviously created waste. So, what can you do to solve this? I standardized every single workstation in that warehouse. I made sure every workstation had the same exact products. Previously, certain workstations had some products or most of the products, and then another workstation would have the extra ones or whatever, the rare items. I standardized operations and made every single workstation symmetrical. This vastly reduced the amount of waste of motion at the warehouse. Another way I worked to eliminate motion was this. I launched weekly update memorandums in the warehouse, and this told all new workers what was going on for the week. So if we launched a new product, the weekly update would go over what launched for the week, what's coming out next week, all that information. This kept workers informed of what's going on, so they didn't need to waste time in motion looking for new items that just launched and things of that nature. Okay, so the next step is waiting. Waiting is another big thing that kills production. So, for example, trying to build collector's boxes of items, right? So, we used to do this a lot. It was a multi piece kit. We set up tables, had a little assembly line going. Let's say 3 or 4 items get put in this box, right? It's a collector's edition launch. You make 10,000 of them, and you need 10,000 of each thing that goes inside. Well, sometimes things got delayed and you get 10,000 of one thing that goes inside of it and you're missing 10,000 of, the little piece that goes with it. So what we do, we'd make tons of pallets of this stuff and have all these collector's boxes with 3 out of the 4 things inside of it needed. And then when the truck finally came with the last shipment of items to go inside, we'd rip them all back open and shove the last item in to complete the collector's kit. Now, making all of these things, putting them on pallets, and then opening them all back up and waiting for them, to get there, that is waste. This is why operations management and logistics is very important in a warehouse and in any business. You don't want to waste time waiting for items to be back in stock. This will hold up your production and create massive bottlenecks. The next one is over processing. This one's interesting. I mean, you don't see this too much, but you definitely see it if you look hard enough. One of the things I personally had an issue with, and I'm still trying to kick the habit 3 years later, is actually like taping boxes with too much tape. That's a good example of overprocessing, but I used to work in a warehouse where we taped up heavy items. So I had a bad habit of, taping boxes twice because the items were heavy. I didn't want them to bust open. I was a supervisor. So I got in the habit of boxing, orders and taping them up very specifically with tape, but now, 3 years later in my own business, I'm shipping things that aren't too heavy in one of my businesses, and I'm personally packing like 2, 3 thousand orders a year in one of my businesses. And guess what? I still put 2 large pieces of tape over every box, even though some of these boxes weigh less than 2 pounds. Because I have a bad habit of over processing with the tape gun from previous experiences. It is waste, and I'm still trying to kick the habit 3 years later. Okay, lastly, we have defects. That's the last step in the process of the 7 steps of waste. So, defects can create bottlenecks for a few reasons. If items are damaged, they'll likely be returned. You're going to have to pay for the damage, and you're going to have to waste time remaking the order and reshipping it. Listen, defects are going to happen, but you want the percentage to be very low. But defects are inevitable and they are going to happen, okay? Defects can mean more than just damaged inventory. One of the worst defects is placing an order that way. Placing the wrong order is a great example of defects. This can cost thousands of dollars, so make sure you always place the correct order. And a pro tip is to put orders in writing. I personally had a $4,000 mistake once because I placed an order over the phone. I was had a really busy week. I was on the road. I didn't put it in writing and I didn't follow up with it in writing, and I'm 100% sure I gave the correct order, but the warehouse manager disagreed and he heard something differently, and it was a really big disaster. So, having things produced slightly incorrectly is a big example of a defect, as is damaged inventory. So, do you guys suffer from some of these steps of waste in your business? I know personally, the warehouses I've worked in, I've seen 3 or 4 of these steps firsthand really have an impact on production. I've also taken steps to mitigate a lot of these steps in past places I've worked and in my own businesses. But as I've said, this is such an important thing to look at. And I even had it printed out above my desk for 2.5 years because I wanted to stare at it every day. And it really forced me to lock in and make changes and become more efficient. So I'm challenging you guys to do the same. Look at this list, identify defects and steps of waste, and always strive for operational excellence. If you like this video, drop a follow, and I will be launching an e-commerce course shortly. Thanks for watching.